Once upon a time there was a woodsman who lived out near the forest with his wife and 2 children. And they were poor. They barely had any food to eat. Well, suddenly there was a drought, and they were really hungry. They were just starving, and the woodsman was so worried. So one night he was just worried and stressed out, and he talked with his wife, and he just didn't know what to do. And so his wife said, "Well, let's just leave the children out in the forest." And the woodsman was shocked. "Oh, there's no way I can do that to our kids." And she said, "Well, you can choose. Either all 4 of us die, or we leave the children out in the woods, and maybe we can live." And they just argued back and forth for quite a while, but eventually the woodsman gave up, and they decided that they were going to leave Hansel and Gretel out in the woods. Well, Hansel and Gretel, they were in the next room, and they heard the whole thing. They were so worried and shocked. Gretel was just crying and crying, but Hansel said, "Don't worry, we'll figure something out." And so, quiet as a mouse, he snuck out of the house, and he looked on the ground, and he saw a bunch of shining pebbles. They were just shining in the moonlight, like fresh minted coins. So he reached down, and he picked up pebbles, and after a while he filled up his pockets, and then he snuck back into the house. Well, in the morning, their parents woke up Hansel and Gretel and said, "It's time to go out and get some wood." And they gave Hansel and Gretel 2 loaves of bread, and because Hansel's pockets were full, Gretel quietly tucked them both away. And they walked into the forest. All the while, Hansel was very carefully dropping stones down on the trail. And they got deep into the forest, and they started a big old fire. And the parents told Hansel and Gretel, "Just wait right here. We're going to collect some wood, and then we'll come and get you, and we'll go on back home." Well, Hansel and Gretel, they waited patiently, and they started to feel kind of tired. So after a time, they drifted off. They took a nice long nap. When they woke up, it was the middle of the night. They were very scared. It was very dark and spooky in that old wood. But with the moonlight shining down, they could see those little pebbles, and they were able to follow them on back home. And it was already morning when they got home, and their stepmother opened the door and shouted at them. She scolded them and said, "You naughty children! Why are you here so late? What have you been doing?" But their father was overjoyed to see them. He'd been feeling so guilty. So he welcomed them back in. And they were happy enough for a time. But then later on, another drought came. And their parents had the same discussion, and they came to the same conclusion. Well, Hansel and Gretel, they heard this all, and they decided to do the same thing. But when Hansel started to sneak out, he found he was locked in. They couldn't go out and get any stones. And Gretel, she was so worried, she was just crying up a storm. But Hansel said, "We'll figure something out, don't worry." So in the morning, their parents woke them up and gave them 2 loaves of bread, and they all marched out into the forest. And Hansel, he had the same idea he had last time, and he started dropping crumbs of bread down on the trail. And he thought he would be able to follow those back home. And this time they went deeper into the forest. It was so dark and spooky, and it just took a long time. Well, the parents set them down, and they built a big campfire, and they told them the same thing. "Just wait here a little bit, and we'll come back and get you. We'll all go on home." Well, Hansel and Gretel, just like last time, they waited very patiently, and they drifted off into a nice long nap. And they woke up in the middle of the night, but when they looked at the trail, all the breadcrumbs were gone. The birds had eaten them clean up. So they were really worried now. And in the morning they walked and they tried to find their way back, but they were so lost. They just walked around in circles. And they spent about 3 days just walking around in the forest. And they were so hungry by now. They were just wasting away, and they thought they were going to die out there in the forest. But they finally came across a little house. And when they got closer, it was made of bread and candy and cookies and all kinds of sweet, delicious things. So they just got up on that house and they just started chomping away, noshing on all that delicious housing. Oh, it was wonderful. And after a time, the door opened and a kind little old lady came out, and she said, "Oh, who are you children? Why have you been left here? Oh, please come inside. I'll take care of you. Don't worry, it's safe." And so they came inside and she made them a wonderful dinner. And after the dinner, they laid down on these soft little children's beds, and they were so happy they drifted off right to sleep. But what they didn't know is that wasn't really a kind old lady. That was an evil witch who loved eating children. Oh, so in the morning while they were still sleeping, she snatched up Hansel and she stuffed him into a cage. And then she woke up Gretel and she said, "Oh, you lazy little girl, it's time for you to start cooking. We're going to fatten up your brother and I'm going to eat him." Oh, and Gretel, oh, she was so upset. She was just crying, but she was so scared she just did whatever the witch told her to do. And every day she would go up to Hansel in his cage, and she didn't see very well, so she would tell him, "Put out your finger so I can see if you're fat enough yet." But Hansel, he was very clever, so he would reach down and he'd pick up a little chicken bone, very thin, and he would push it through the cage, and the old witch, she would touch that chicken bone and she'd think, "Oh, why are you so thin?" And he was able to keep up this trick for about 4 long weeks. But then the witch, she started to get impatient, and she told Gretel, "Oh, tomorrow we're gonna cook up your brother. Be he fat or be he thin, I'm going to eat him up." Well, Gretel, she was really upset now. What could she do? They were doomed. Oh, so the next morning, the old witch had gotten the oven ready. It was just piping hot. And she turned to Gretel and she said, "We're going to bake up your brother first. Now go on in and check and see if the fire's hot enough." Because she planned to cook up Gretel like that. But Gretel, she saw those flames and she was so scared. She said, "Oh, I don't think that oven's big enough for me." And the old witch, she said, "Oh, of course it's big enough. Here, let me show you. Watch me." And she opened up the door and she stuck her head in and she said, "See?" Oh, and Gretel took that moment. She pushed the witch into the oven and she slammed the door. And then she went and she unlocked her brother, and they were so happy to be free. Well, then they looked around the house and they found all kinds of treasure in all the corners and nooks and crannies. So they filled their pockets up with treasure and with food, and they started marching out. And they walked along the forest trying to find their way back home. And after a while, things started to look more familiar, and they eventually came back to their house. And their father opened the door, and he was so happy to see them. Oh, he had missed them so much, and he was so regretful for what he'd done. And they found out that their wicked stepmother had passed away while they'd been gone. And so the 3 of them, with all that treasure, why, they lived as a happy family. happily ever